It was a quiet evening in the suburbs, the kind where the fading light of dusk bathed the streets in a golden hue, and the hum of passing cars blended with the faint chirping of crickets. The young man behind the wheel of his sleek, black sedan had been driving for nearly an hour, coming from his college class, his mind focused on the assignment he was mentally drafting. His music played softly in the background, providing a soundtrack to his thoughts. He wasn't speeding, not weaving between cars or doing anything remotely erratic, just calmly cruising through his neighborhood, familiar streets lined with trees he'd passed hundreds of times before. Suddenly, a flash of blue and red lights lit up the inside of his car, the distinctive blare of a siren echoing through his rearview mirror. He sighed, his heart sinking slightly as he glanced back to confirm what he already knew. A police cruiser was right behind him, lights spinning, urging him to pull over. With a quick glance at his speedometer, he realized he wasn't even 5 miles over the speed limit. Confused but not panicked, he flicked on his turn signal and pulled over to the side of the road, his car coming to a slow, deliberate stop. The street was relatively empty, the occasional car passing by, oblivious to what was happening. His thoughts raced as he shifted into park and waited for the officer to approach. The young man, Malcolm, had been in this situation before. Not often, but enough times for it to be an uncomfortable routine. He'd grown used to the peculiar nervousness that came from encounters with law enforcement, a feeling he couldn't shake even though he had nothing to hide. His father, a respected police captain, had always drilled into him the rules of how to conduct himself during a stop. Keep your hands visible, don't make any sudden movements, answer politely and always comply, no matter what. Malcolm knew the drill well. He lowered the volume on his music, exhaled slowly, and rolled down his window, preparing for the encounter. In the rearview mirror, he saw the officer step out of the cruiser, taking his time, his movements slow and deliberate. The cop's hand rested on the holster of his gun as he approached, his face unreadable behind the reflective sunglasses he wore, even though the sun had nearly set. Malcolm's heart picked up speed, but outwardly he remained calm. He reached for his wallet, resting it on his lap but keeping his hands on the steering wheel, just as his father had taught him. The cop's heavy boots crunched against the gravel as he reached the driver's side window. There was an air of tension that Malcolm could feel, even before the officer spoke. "License and registration," the cop said, his voice cold and authoritative. No greeting, no explanation for why Malcolm had been pulled over, just a demand. "Yes, sir," Malcolm replied, keeping his voice steady and respectful. He reached slowly towards the glove compartment to retrieve his registration, his movements deliberate, careful not to appear as if he was reaching for anything else. He handed over the documents along with his driver's license. The officer glanced at the documents but didn't seem particularly interested in them. Instead, his gaze shifted back to Malcolm, studying him closely. There was an uncomfortable silence before the officer spoke again. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the cop asked, his tone now dripping with condescension, as if the answer was already obvious to him, even though it wasn't to Malcolm. Malcolm hesitated for a second, trying to figure out the right response. "No, officer, I wasn't aware I was doing anything wrong," he said cautiously. The officer raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. He took off his sunglasses, revealing a pair of sharp, cold eyes that seemed to size Malcolm up in an instant. "You were going 5 miles over the speed limit. Didn't you notice?" Malcolm blinked in surprise. 5 miles over? It seemed like such a minor infraction, hardly worth the flashing lights and the stern demeanor. Most people would have been given a warning, or perhaps not pulled over at all, but Malcolm knew better than to question the officer, especially at a time like this. He'd seen too many stories of situations like these going wrong, too many lives affected by a simple traffic stop spiraling out of control. "I'm sorry, officer," Malcolm replied, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't realize." The cop leaned in slightly, his hand still resting on the holster. "You didn't realize, or you just didn't care?" There was something in the officer's tone that made Malcolm's stomach tighten. It wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. It felt like something more was at play here. The officer's eyes lingered on Malcolm's face, as if searching for something, looking at him not as a college student on his way home, but as a potential threat. Malcolm could feel the weight of that gaze, the implicit suspicion that followed him wherever he went. "I didn't mean to speed," Malcolm said, his voice steady but his pulse quickening. "If there's anything else I can provide—" The officer cut him off. "Step out of the vehicle." Malcolm froze for a moment, the words sinking in. His mind raced. Step out of the vehicle? For what? He hadn't done anything wrong, and this was escalating faster than it should have. But Malcolm knew this wasn't the time to argue or resist. He had to stay composed, just like his father had always told him. His father's voice echoed in his head, reminding him to stay calm, to not provoke. "Is there a reason, officer?" Malcolm asked carefully, keeping his hands on the wheel, showing no signs of defiance. The officer's expression hardened. "Are you refusing to follow a lawful order?" His hand shifted slightly on the holster, a subtle but unmistakable signal of dominance, of control. "No, sir," Malcolm quickly responded, not wanting to escalate the situation further. "I'll step out." He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly and opened the door. As he stood up, the cool evening air hit his face, a contrast to the growing tension in his chest. He raised his hand slightly, palms visible, showing he had nothing to hide. The officer motioned for him to move to the side of the car, closer to the sidewalk. "Turn around and face the car," the cop ordered. Malcolm complied, his mind racing. He had done everything by the book, exactly how he was supposed to. Yet here he was, standing by the side of the road, being treated like a suspect, all for going 5 miles over the speed limit. He could feel the stares of passing drivers, the humiliation beginning to set in. He was just another young black man on the side of the road, at the mercy of a police officer who seemed more interested in asserting his authority than conducting a fair stop. As the officer began patting him down, Malcolm's frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. He knew he was being singled out for more than just a traffic violation. The officer's actions, his tone, and the way he looked at Malcolm, everything pointed to a deeper bias. Malcolm clenched his jaw, wondering how far this would go, if he'd be able to walk away from this stop without it turning into something worse. He thought about his father, how proud he was of the legacy his father had built in the police force. And yet here he was, being treated like an outsider, like he didn't belong. The officer finished his search, finding nothing, but that didn't seem to satisfy him. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing at Malcolm as if trying to decide what to do next. Malcolm stood still, his pulse quick, but his expression composed, knowing this was only the beginning of the encounter. As Malcolm stood by the side of his car, his back pressed against the cold metal, the uncomfortable tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. The officer had finished patting him down, but hadn't yet backed off. Instead, he stood close, glaring at Malcolm with an intensity that made it clear this stop was about more than a minor traffic violation. Malcolm's frustration churned beneath the surface, but he knew he had to keep it bottled up. Any sign of irritation or defiance could only make things worse. The officer's hand never strayed too far from his holster, as if he was constantly reminding Malcolm and himself of the power he held in this interaction. Malcolm glanced down at his car, wondering how such a simple drive had escalated into this strange and unnerving situation. He hadn't been rude, hadn't resisted, yet here he was, standing in the fading light, treated like a suspect instead of a law-abiding citizen. "Where are you headed?" the officer finally asked, breaking the silence. His tone wasn't friendly or even neutral. It was accusatory, as though Malcolm's destination was a matter of guilt in itself. "Home," Malcolm replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm coming back from school." The officer raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk, as if he didn't quite believe him. "School, huh? What, you think you're too smart to follow the speed limit?" Malcolm resisted the urge to sigh, biting back the frustration that bubbled inside him. This was the pattern. The cop wasn't interested in facts or explanations. He was interested in establishing dominance, in making Malcolm feel small. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was personal. The officer's attitude radiated disdain, a simmering hostility that Malcolm knew all too well. He'd seen it before, felt it in passing glances on the street or in stores. It was the unspoken judgment that clung to him simply because of who he was. "No, sir," Malcolm said, still respectful. "I wasn't trying to break any rules." If I was speeding, I apologize. I didn't realize. The officer leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. Didn't realize? Or didn't care? People like you think you can just do whatever you want, don't you? Think you're above the law? Malcolm blinked, startled by the sudden escalation in tone. People like you. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was a phrase Malcolm had heard in different forms throughout his life, each time reminding him that no matter what he accomplished, no matter how law-abiding or well-educated he was, there were always going to be people who saw him as a threat, as less. His pulse quickened, but he maintained his composure. He knew better than to react. His father's advice echoed in his head once again. Don't give them a reason. But how could he not react to something so blatant, so unjust? How could he stand there being treated like a criminal when he'd done nothing wrong? I didn't mean to speed, sir, Malcolm repeated, his voice calm, though the anger was creeping in around the edges. I'm just trying to get home. The officer scoffed, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Sure you are. And I'm supposed to believe you're just some innocent college kid, right? Driving around in a car like this? He gestured toward Malcolm's sedan, as though the vehicle itself was proof of some hidden guilt. Malcolm frowned. It's my car, The officer cut him off, holding up a hand. Let me guess. Daddy bought it for you? Must be nice, huh? Just cruising around in your fancy car, thinking the rules don't apply to you. At this point, Malcolm's frustration was hard to contain. His jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay still. This wasn't the time to lose his cool, even though every word the cop said stung like a personal insult. The officer was baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction, and Malcolm wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. It's my car, officer, he said firmly but politely. I worked hard for it. The officer's smirk didn't waver. Yeah, I'm sure you did, he said sarcastically, pacing slowly around the car now, examining it as though expecting to find some hidden stash of contraband. But you know what I think? I think you've got something to hide. You look a little too nervous for someone who's just coming home from school. Malcolm swallowed hard, the knot of anger in his chest tightening. Of course he was nervous. Who wouldn't be in this situation? But he knew that was part of the officer's game, using his nerves as justification for treating him like a suspect, even when there was no reason to. It was a twisted logic, one that painted Malcolm as guilty no matter what he did. If he stayed calm, he was suspicious. If he showed fear, he was hiding something. I'm not hiding anything, Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the tension in his muscles. I've complied with everything you've asked. The officer stopped pacing and faced Malcolm again, his hand once more resting on the butt of his gun. You're damn right you have, and you'll keep doing what I ask until I'm satisfied? Malcolm felt a surge of indignation rise in him. He wanted to shout, to demand to know why this was happening, why he was being treated like this. But he knew better. He knew that any outburst, any show of frustration, could be twisted against him, used as an excuse to escalate the situation even further. The officer narrowed his eyes as though sensing the conflict raging inside Malcolm. What's wrong? Not used to being held accountable? Don't like it when someone calls you out on your bullshit? Malcolm stared straight ahead, trying to block out the cop's words. He could feel the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but he fought it, clinging to his composure. He'd done nothing wrong. He knew that. But in this moment, it didn't seem to matter. The cop wasn't interested in fairness or justice. This was about power, his power over Malcolm, the ability to make him feel small, to make him feel like he didn't belong. You know, the officer continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy, if you're really as innocent as you say, then you've got nothing to worry about. So why don't we take a little look inside your car? See if everything checks out. Malcolm stiffened. This was exactly the kind of escalation he had feared. A search. For what? Over a minor speeding violation? He hadn't done anything to warrant such an invasive step, but the way the officer was looking at him, with that thinly veiled smirk, made it clear that this was never just about speeding. This was about control. It was about reminding Malcolm that, in the eyes of this officer, he wasn't just a citizen, he was a suspect. I don't consent to a search, officer, Malcolm said, his voice measured but firm. His father had told him he had every right to refuse a search if there was no probable cause. He wasn't going to let this cop bully him into giving up his rights. The officer's smirk faded, replaced by a hardened glare. "Oh, so now you're going to start giving me orders? Is that it?" "No, sir," Malcolm replied quickly, careful not to let his tone sound defiant. "I'm just exercising my rights." The officer took a step closer, his voice low and threatening. "You think I give a damn about your rights? You think a little refusal's going to stop me from doing my job?" Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest. He felt the walls closing in, the power imbalance growing more apparent with each passing second. This officer wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to admit he had no cause for this search. In his eyes, Malcolm was already guilty of something. He just needed to find the excuse to make it official. But before the officer could take another step, Malcolm's phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should ignore it, but something inside him told him to answer. Slowly, he reached for his phone, keeping his movements deliberate so as not to alarm the officer. "I need to take this," Malcolm said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. The officer frowned, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "You don't get to decide what happens here, kid." Malcolm ignored the comment and glanced at the screen. It was his father calling. Malcolm stared at his phone, feeling a wave of relief mixed with apprehension as his father's name lit up the screen. Captain James Reed. A man of immense respect and authority within the police department, his father was someone who had dedicated his entire life to upholding the law and ensuring fairness within the system. But now the system seemed to be turning against his son in the most unexpected and unjust way. The officer standing before Malcolm noticed the phone buzzing, and his expression twisted with impatience. "What, you think a phone call is going to get you out of this?" he sneered, his hand tightening on his belt. "Go ahead, take it, see how much that helps you." Malcolm's fingers were steady as he pressed the button to answer the call. He turned slightly away from the officer, making sure his voice remained even and calm, despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "Hey, Dad," Malcolm said, his voice controlled but carrying the weight of the situation. "Malcolm, what's going on? You sound tense." His father's deep, reassuring voice came through the line. It was a voice Malcolm had grown up listening to, a voice that always made him feel safe. But in this moment, it was also the voice of authority, one that could potentially shift the power dynamic of this traffic stop. "I got pulled over," Malcolm replied, keeping his eyes forward. He didn't want to give the officer any reason to escalate things further, but he knew he had to tell his father what was happening. "I was driving home from school and the officer has me outside the car. He's threatening to search it." The silence on the other end of the line lasted just a fraction of a second, but in that moment, Malcolm could sense his father processing the situation, his mind clicking into gear. Captain Reed had been in law enforcement for over 2 decades. He'd seen and dealt with more incidents of racial profiling and abuse of power than most officers, and now it was happening to his son. "Put me on speaker," his father said, his tone suddenly sharp, authoritative. Malcolm obeyed, his hand steady as he pressed the speaker button. "You're on speaker," he said quietly. "Officer," Captain Reed's voice boomed through the small speaker on Malcolm's phone, carrying a weight that immediately demanded attention. "This is Captain James Reed of the Metropolitan Police Department. I'd like to know why my son is being detained." The shift in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The officer, who had been so confident and smug just moments before, suddenly stiffened. His posture changed, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. For the first time since the stop began, he hesitated, glancing at Malcolm as if reassessing the entire situation. "Captain Reed?" the officer repeated, his voice suddenly more guarded. His hand, which had been resting casually on his holster, now dropped to his side. He took a small step back, the bravado from earlier evaporating. "Yes," Captain Reed's voice was firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "My son, Malcolm Reed. What seems to be the issue, officer?" The officer cleared his throat, clearly thrown off balance by this new development. Officer Daniels, sir. I pulled him over for speeding. He was going 5 miles over the limit." Captain Reed paused, and Malcolm could almost hear his father calculating his response. 5 miles over the speed limit? And that required you to search him and ask him to step out of the vehicle? Officer Daniels fidgeted, visibly uncomfortable now. His initial air of superiority had been stripped away, and all that remained was a man trying to justify his actions under scrutiny. He seemed nervous, sir. I wanted to make sure everything was safe. Safe? Captain Reed's voice was steely now, the kind of tone Malcolm had only heard his father use in moments of extreme seriousness. Officer Daniels, my son informed me that he complied with all of your instructions. Is that correct? Yes, sir, Daniels replied, his voice dropping a few degrees in volume. But he was acting suspicious, and I was concerned there might be something in the vehicle. Acting suspicious? Captain Reed repeated, his voice cutting through the officer's weak justification like a knife. Officer Daniels, let me make this clear. Pulling someone over for a minor traffic violation does not give you the right to treat them as a suspect of a crime, especially when they've complied with your requests. My son is not a criminal, and you had no reason to escalate this situation. Malcolm watched as Daniel squirmed under the weight of his father's words. The officer had lost his footing, his authority slipping with every passing second. It was evident that he hadn't anticipated this turn of events, hadn't expected his routine show of power to be challenged by someone who outranked him. I understand, sir, Daniel stammered, his face flushed now. The smirk and arrogance from earlier had vanished completely. I didn't mean to. Let me stop you right there, Captain Reed interrupted. I'm on my way. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Until then, you will allow my son to return to his vehicle, and you will not touch a single thing. Is that understood? Daniel swallowed hard, clearly realizing that he had overstepped. Yes, sir. Understood. Malcolm could see the internal struggle on Daniel's face. The officer was used to being in control of these situations, but now he was being held accountable in a way that he likely hadn't expected. His usual playbook of intimidation and dominance wasn't going to work here. Malcolm, his father's voice softened slightly, addressing his son now. Are you okay? I'm fine, Dad, Malcolm said, feeling some of the tension begin to drain from his body. Just hearing his father take control of the situation made him feel safer, more grounded. I'm okay. Good, I'll be there soon, his father assured him. Stay calm and wait for me. This will be handled. Malcolm nodded even though his father couldn't see him. Okay. As the call ended, Malcolm slipped his phone back into his pocket, turning his attention back to Officer Daniels. The officer was standing there, looking unsure of himself, his earlier confidence completely deflated. He shifted awkwardly from foot to foot, clearly waiting for the next move. You can get back in your car, Daniel said, his tone now flat, almost defeated. He no longer looked at Malcolm with the same disdain. In fact, he barely made eye contact at all. Malcolm nodded silently and walked back to his car, opening the door and sliding into the driver's seat. He shut the door behind him, but didn't start the engine. Instead, he sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel, the events of the last half hour replaying in his mind. The sheer absurdity of it all hit him again, being pulled over for such a minor infraction and treated as though he was a criminal. He hadn't been doing anything wrong, hadn't even raised his voice, and yet the situation had escalated simply because of the color of his skin. It wasn't the first time Malcolm had experienced something like this, but each time it happened, it left a deeper mark. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Officer Daniels standing by his patrol car, no longer making any movements toward him. The officer looked restless, as though he was dreading what was coming next. And Malcolm couldn't help but think that if it hadn't been for that phone call, if it hadn't been for his father's rank and authority, things might have gone very differently. 10 minutes later, another set of flashing lights appeared in the distance, but these were different. They belonged to an unmarked police car. As the vehicle approached, Malcolm's heart swelled with a strange mix of relief and pride. His father had arrived. The car pulled up next to the scene, and out stepped Captain Reed, dressed in his uniform, his expression set in the serious, no-nonsense demeanor that Malcolm had seen many times before. His father was a man who commanded respect, not through intimidation, but through the integrity with which he carried himself. His presence alone shifted the energy of the entire situation. Captain Reed walked directly over to Officer Daniels, who straightened up immediately, his nervousness visible from where Malcolm sat. Malcolm stayed in the car, watching as his father approached the officer. Though he couldn't hear the exact words exchanged, he could see the difference in how Daniels reacted to his father. The bravado was gone, replaced by a stammering apology. Daniels gestured toward Malcolm's car several times, trying to explain himself, but Captain Reed didn't seem interested in excuses. After a brief but intense conversation, Captain Reed turned and made his way toward Malcolm's car. He knocked gently on the window, and Malcolm rolled it down, looking up at his father with a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "You okay, son?" his father asked, his tone soft but serious. Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, I'm good now." Captain Reed nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Let's go home," he said quietly. "I'll take care of the rest." Captain James Reed stood tall, his police uniform crisp and his eyes sharp as he surveyed the scene. The tension that had blanketed the situation since Malcolm was first pulled over seemed to crack and shift the moment he arrived. There was something about the presence of authority, the kind of authority that didn't need a weapon to assert itself, that immediately altered the dynamics. Officer Daniels, who had once worn a look of smug dominance, now looked pale and unsure. He fidgeted by his cruiser, stealing glances at Captain Reed as though hoping for some sort of clemency. But the captain wasn't one to be easily swayed by guilt or apologies, especially not when it came to his son. Malcolm remained in his car, watching as his father took control of the situation. He knew that the captain's reputation was impeccable. His father had built a career on integrity, fairness, and a firm belief in justice. He had spent years trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, especially the Black community, which had historically been the target of over-policing and unfair treatment. Now that very issue had touched their family, and Malcolm could see in his father's eyes that this wasn't going to be brushed aside. Captain Reed walked slowly toward Officer Daniels, every step deliberate, his face unreadable. Daniels straightened his back reflexively, trying to maintain what little composure he had left. When Captain Reed finally stopped in front of him, there was a silence that felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on the scene. "Officer Daniels," Captain Reed began, his voice calm but carrying a dangerous edge. "I want to hear it from you. Why was my son pulled over?" Daniels hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking to Malcolm's car and then back to the captain. His once confident posture had crumbled into something meek and defensive. "Sir, as I explained earlier, he was speeding 5 miles over the limit. I pulled him over to issue a warning or citation." Captain Reed's face remained impassive, though there was a fire in his eyes that Malcolm recognized. It was the look his father reserved for moments when the truth wasn't adding up. "And you thought speeding warranted him being ordered out of the vehicle? Why was that necessary?" Daniels fumbled with his words. "Well, sir, he seemed nervous. I thought it might be a sign of—" "Nervous?" Captain Reed's voice cut in sharply, slicing through Daniels' explanation like a blade. "Let me make sure I understand this, Officer Daniels. My son, a young Black man, is driving home from school, and you pull him over for a minor speeding infraction. Then because he appears nervous, you decide that's enough to treat him as a suspect? That's enough to order him out of the car and threaten to search his vehicle?" The way Captain Reed phrased the questions left no room for escape. Daniels could feel the ground slipping from beneath him, and for the first time, he seemed to understand the gravity of what he had done. But it was too late to turn back now. "Sir, I was just following protocol," Daniels tried to explain, but the captain cut him off again. "Protocol?" Captain Reed's voice was low and dangerous now. "Let me tell you something about protocol, Officer Daniels. There's nothing in the manual that says you escalate a situation with a compliant driver for no reason. There's nothing in the manual that says nervousness is probable cause to treat someone like a criminal. You had no right to escalate this stop, and you know it." Daniels looked down, his confidence eroding with each word. His eyes shifted nervously as he realized he had nowhere to hide. Captain Reed took a step closer, his voice still controlled, but laden with authority. "Do you know who I am, Officer Daniels? Do you know what I stand for?" "Yes, sir," Daniels mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're a captain with the department." Captain Reed nodded slowly. That's right. I've worked for this department for over 20 years. I've fought hard to ensure that officers under my command treat every person with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of their race, background, or socioeconomic status. What you did today goes against everything I stand for, everything the law is supposed to represent. Daniel swallowed hard, his face reddening. The weight of his actions seemed to crash down on him all at once, and he was visibly shrinking under Captain Reed's gaze. "Do you think this kind of behavior goes unnoticed?" Captain Reed continued, his voice unwavering. "Do you think pulling over young black men and escalating the situation without cause won't have consequences? Because let me assure you, Officer Daniels, it does. And those consequences will start now." The threat of consequences hung in the air like a cloud ready to burst. Daniels opened his mouth as if to protest, but the words died before they left his throat. There was nothing he could say. He had overstepped, and now he was face to face with a man who wasn't going to let him walk away without accountability. Captain Reed took a breath, steadying himself, but his eyes never left Daniels. "I expect a full report of this incident on my desk first thing tomorrow morning," he said, his voice firm. "You will explain every decision you made today, every step of this traffic stop, and you will be held accountable for any and all violations of protocol. Am I clear?" Daniels nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." Captain Reed didn't say another word to him. He turned on his heel and walked back toward Malcolm's car, his footsteps steady and deliberate, leaving Officer Daniels to stand by his cruiser, his confidence shattered and his future uncertain. When Captain Reed reached Malcolm's car, he leaned down slightly, his face softening as he looked at his son. "You all right?" Malcolm nodded, though he still felt a tightness in his chest. "I'm fine, Dad. Thanks for stepping in." Captain Reed gave a small, reassuring smile. "Of course, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Malcolm had grown up admiring his father's sense of justice, but seeing it applied to his own situation filled him with both pride and frustration. He had been lucky. Not every young black man in America had a father who was a police captain, someone with the power to challenge an officer's mistreatment. Malcolm knew that, and it gnawed at him that his safety in the end had depended on his father's rank, not on the fairness of the system. As they both stood there, the street quiet around them now, Captain Reed placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "I've spent my whole career fighting for change from the inside. I'm going to make sure what happened today isn't just swept under the rug." Malcolm nodded, feeling the gravity of his father's words. He appreciated his father's resolve, but a part of him also felt a deep, gnawing frustration. "Dad, you know this happens all the time. It happened to me tonight. But what about the guys who don't have a captain for a dad? What about them?" Captain Reed's expression darkened. He knew his son was right. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger problem, one that wouldn't be fixed with a single disciplinary action against an officer. "You're right, Malcolm," he admitted quietly. "I've seen too much of this. We've made progress, but it's not enough. Not nearly enough." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in. Malcolm felt the frustration boiling inside him, a frustration that his father had lived with his entire career. They both knew that change would be slow, that the system itself was deeply flawed, but neither of them was willing to accept that as an excuse to stop fighting for what was right. As they prepared to leave, Captain Reed gave Malcolm one last look. "We'll handle this, son. Officer Daniels will be held accountable, and I'll make sure it goes up the chain." Malcolm nodded, appreciating his father's determination, though he couldn't help but feel a pang of skepticism. He had grown up hearing his father's speeches about justice and integrity, but seeing how easily the system could turn on someone like him, despite his father's position, had made him question how much progress had really been made. "Let's go home," Captain Reed said quietly, giving his son a small, reassuring pat on the shoulder. They both got into their cars, and as Malcolm started his engine, he took one last glance in the rearview mirror. Officer Daniels was still standing by his cruiser, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. Malcolm didn't feel triumphant, though. There was no real victory in what had happened tonight. It was a reminder that even someone like him, with a father in the force, wasn't immune to the dangers of racial profiling and bias. So as they drove away, Malcolm couldn't shake the thought that for every incident like his, there were countless others that ended without accountability. The road ahead was long, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without doing something about it. His father had taught him that justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you demanded, and Malcolm was ready to start demanding. The drive home felt both surreal and heavy for Malcolm. The weight of what had just happened lingered in the air, hanging over him like a storm cloud threatening to burst at any moment. He could feel the tension radiating from his father, who sat in the passenger seat, his expression a mixture of resolve and frustration. It was a familiar look that Malcolm had seen before, usually after difficult days at the precinct, where his father worked tirelessly to bring about change. But tonight, it was personal. As they pulled into their driveway, Malcolm felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude mixed with a tinge of anger. He had been spared from a potentially dangerous situation because of his father's authority. But what about the countless others who didn't have that safety net? Those thoughts churned in his mind as he parked the car and turned off the engine. "Let's talk," Captain Reed said as they stepped out, his tone serious but calm. Malcolm nodded, knowing that his father needed to address the events of the evening. They walked inside the house, the familiar warmth of home contrasting sharply with the coldness of the encounter they had just left behind. Once inside, Captain Reed gestured for Malcolm to take a seat at the kitchen table, a sturdy oak piece that had seen many family discussions, both serious and lighthearted. As Malcolm settled into his chair, his father poured 2 glasses of water, handing one to him before sitting across the table. "Malcolm," his father began, his voice steady, "I want to start by saying I'm proud of you. You handled that situation with incredible composure. I know how frustrating and scary it can be." "Thanks, Dad," Malcolm replied, taking a sip of water, the coolness soothing his dry throat. "But it's hard to feel proud when it seems like I was only saved because of who I am." Captain Reed leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, fingers steepled together. "That's a reality we have to face, son. It's not fair, and it's not right. But what you experienced tonight is a reflection of a much larger issue in our society. The systemic bias that leads to situations like yours is something I've been fighting against my entire career." Malcolm listened intently, the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. But fighting against it is only part of the solution, right? It doesn't change the fact that it happened to me, or that it happens to others every day. His father sighed, a heavy, weighted sound that filled the quiet kitchen. "You're right. It doesn't change what happened to you, and I know it's hard to see the bigger picture when you're in the middle of something like this. But I want you to understand that it's not just about individual incidents. It's about changing the system itself, holding people accountable, and working toward a future where this isn't the norm." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the anger swirling inside him. "But how? How do we change something so deeply ingrained? What can I do?" Captain Reed studied his son for a moment, recognizing the fire in his eyes. "You can be a voice, Malcolm. You can advocate for change in your community, educate others about these issues, and work with organizations that are fighting for justice. It starts with conversations like this, but it doesn't end here. You have the power to make a difference." "I know I want to do something," Malcolm said, the passion growing in his voice. "But what if it feels like no one is listening? What if it feels hopeless?" The captain nodded, understanding the depth of his son's concerns. "That's a very real feeling. Many people feel that way, and it's part of why change is slow. But every voice matters. Every action counts. It's about persistence. It's about standing up and saying, 'I won't accept this.' And sometimes it's about holding those in power accountable, even when it feels uncomfortable." Malcolm took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his father's words. The night's events had opened his eyes in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always admired his father's dedication to justice, but now he felt that same fire igniting within himself. He wanted to fight back against the injustice he had witnessed and experienced. "What are you going to do about Officer Daniels?" Malcolm asked, curiosity lacing his tone. "I mean, you said you'd make sure he faced consequences." Captain Reed straightened in his chair, his expression shifting to one of determination. "I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing in the morning. It will include all the details of the incident, along with my recommendations for disciplinary action. I'll also be discussing this with my superiors to ensure it's taken seriously. We need to set a precedent that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated, regardless of rank or position." Malcolm felt a surge of pride in his father's commitment to justice. "That's good, but what happens after that? What if he just gets a slap on the wrist? What if he doesn't change?" Captain Reed sighed, the weight of the systemic issues pressing down on him. "That's the hard part, son. There are no guarantees. The system often protects its own, and there are many instances where officers are not held accountable for their actions. But I can promise you this. I will do everything in my power to ensure that Daniels faces the consequences he deserves. And I will keep pushing for reform in our department." Malcolm nodded, a mixture of admiration and frustration swirling inside him. What if we did something more? What if we organized a community meeting, invited people to share their stories? Maybe we could raise awareness about what's happening. Captain Reed leaned back, considering his son's suggestion. "That's a great idea. Community engagement is crucial for change. The more voices we can bring to the table, the better. It shows the department that this issue affects real people, real lives, not just the statistics on a page." Malcolm felt a surge of hope. "We could start with our neighbors, maybe even reach out to local organizations. There are a lot of people in the community who have experienced similar things." "Exactly," his father encouraged, his eyes lighting up at the prospect. "It could be a powerful way to not only raise awareness, but also build support for reforms. If we can create a united front, we stand a better chance of making real changes within the department." The conversation flowed naturally from there, ideas bouncing back and forth like a lively tennis match. They discussed potential topics for the community meeting, ways to engage local leaders, and even how to utilize social media to amplify their message. Malcolm felt invigorated, energized by the thought of taking action instead of just being a passive observer in his own life. As the evening wore on, Malcolm began to feel a sense of purpose blossoming within him. He had spent so much time feeling helpless and frustrated by the injustices he saw, but now he realized he could channel that energy into something productive. He had the chance to be part of the solution, to work alongside his father and others who cared about change. Captain Reed's phone buzzed on the table, interrupting their brainstorming session. He glanced at the screen, and Malcolm could see the slight furrow in his brow. "I need to take this," he said, standing up and moving to the side of the kitchen. Malcolm watched as his father stepped out of earshot, his expression shifting to one of seriousness as he answered the call. Alone at the table, he took a moment to reflect on everything they had discussed. The resolve he felt was palpable. He was ready to take action. The call lasted several minutes, and as Captain Reed returned to the table, his demeanor was more serious than before. He had clearly been pulled back into the complexities of his job. "I have to head back to the precinct," he said, glancing at the clock. "There are some immediate follow-ups I need to address regarding other cases. But I want you to keep thinking about our discussion tonight." "Of course, Dad," Malcolm replied, a sense of determination welling up within him. "I'll start making a plan for the meeting. I'll reach out to some friends, see who else might want to get involved." Captain Reed smiled, a mix of pride and concern etched on his face. "Just be careful, Malcolm. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it can sometimes attract unwanted attention. But I believe in you. You have the power to make a difference." Malcolm felt the weight of his father's words. He wasn't just a passive participant in this world. He was part of a movement, a community seeking justice. And with that realization came a renewed sense of purpose. As his father gathered his things to leave, Malcolm stood up to give him a hug. "Be safe out there, Dad." "You too, son. We'll get through this together." Captain Reed stepped back, giving Malcolm one last encouraging smile before heading for the door. As Malcolm watched his father leave, he felt a mix of emotions churning within him. Anger, frustration, determination, and hope all collided. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to embrace it. He was ready to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly, for everyone who had faced injustice simply because of the color of their skin. After his father left, Malcolm sat back down at the kitchen table, his mind racing with ideas. He grabbed a notepad and a pen, determined to jot down everything that came to mind. The first step would be gathering stories, compiling experiences from people in his community. He could use social media to create a platform for sharing those experiences, reaching out to local organizations and activists who had been working toward change for years. As he wrote, a vision began to take shape in his mind, a community meeting that would serve as a safe space for voices to be heard, a gathering that would unite people in their shared experiences and frustrations. He would organize it in the park down the street, a familiar place where neighbors gathered for community events. The excitement bubbled up inside him as he continued to write. He could contact local churches, youth organizations, and advocacy groups, inviting them to join the conversation. This meeting would be about empowerment, about showing the community that they had the strength to stand together against injustice. Hours passed as Malcolm mapped out his ideas, filled with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt before. It was late when he finally stood up, stretching and looking around the quiet house. He felt a sense of anticipation for the future, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long journey. As he turned off the lights and headed to bed, Malcolm's thoughts were still racing. He had a lot to do, and while the challenges ahead were daunting, he knew that with determination and support from his father and the community, change was possible. He closed his eyes, envisioning the gathering he hoped to create, a powerful movement that would stand against the injustices he had experienced and witnessed, a movement that would honor the countless voices that had gone unheard for far too long. He drifted off to sleep, feeling a sense of hope and resolve that had previously eluded him. The world was complicated and often unjust, but Malcolm was ready to be a part of the solution. With his father's guidance and the support of his community, he would not rest until justice was served, not just for him, but for everyone who deserved a voice.